Mexico has made history with the election of its first ever female president. But after a deadly campaign, what is the plan to rein in drug cartels? And how will the results impact relations with its neighbour, the United States? Claudia Sheinbaum secured a landslide victory and called on her divided country to walk together in peace and harmony. How can she bring peace amid an epidemic of drugs violence with 37 political assassinations during the campaign? Our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey joins me live from Mexico with his analysis in a moment. We're also in India, where there are scenes of desperation as the country grapples with a heat wave that's killed more than 50 people in 3 days and could go on for another month. Plus, the global risks of President Putin winning in Ukraine will bring you an interview with the head of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg. And President Biden expresses boundless love for his son, Hunter, as his criminal trial over gun charges gets underway. That's all coming up on The World with me, Dominic Waghorn. In a bumper year of elections worldwide, one of the most important was always going to be Mexico's, not least because what happens in Mexico does not stay there. It affects the everyday lives of Americans over the border and the politics of the United States, which in turn affects all of us too. Mexico is America's biggest trading partner, but also the source of massive amounts of deadly drugs and huge flows of migrants. It has just had its biggest and bloodiest election ever, with 37 candidates killed. The outcome brings both change and continuity. It's given Mexico its first female president, Claudia Sheinbaum, a protege of her predecessor, and in terms of policy, she offers more of the same. It's fair to say her success or not, tackling the big issues of corruption, drug cartels, crime, and the border will have major repercussions in Mexico's richer, more powerful neighbour to the north, especially as the country decides whether to re-elect Joe Biden or bring about the second coming of Donald Trump. How would Claudia Sheinbaum deal with that? We'll discuss that in a moment. First, our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey, sent this report from the Mexican state of Chihuahua.
As the first election returns indicated a huge win for Claudia Sheinbaum, a massive celebration began in Mexico City's Zocalo Square. The first female president in the country's history, the first woman with the top job in all of North America. Many thought it could never happen in Mexico. The president-elect fully aware of the significance of her victory.
Es el reconocimiento del pueblo de México.
It is the recognition of the people of Mexico to our national project.
Agradezco también.
I'm also grateful because for the first time in 200 years of the Republic, I will become the first woman president of Mexico.
Me convertiré en la primera mujer presidenta de México.
Her party's social reforms, crucially pensions for the poorest, was the game changer. Policies, she says, that will continue.
We will maintain a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, and guarantee all of President López Obrador's welfare programs.
Across the country, electoral lawyers like Susana Mercado pored over the results. This wasn't just a presidential election, it's about control of Congress. For the faithful, it's a new beginning for Mexico.
Having the first female president in North America is very symbolic in a country such as Mexico, because machismo here is something that is very hard to work with, and women in spaces of power really have to struggle to get there. So I am a big fan of the president right now, and we cannot just be very happy because people went out and voted for a woman in Mexico. It's blowing my mind.
This was Mexico's biggest election, but has been marred by political assassination and violence. In the conservative north, the new president isn't hugely popular. It won't all be plain sailing.
This is such a big win for the new president and her political party. They'll even have the power to change elements of the constitution, which is something they've been wanting to do for a very long time. But there are other big issues she has to address. The power of the cartels is one of them, corruption, and also personal security, the biggest issue for Mexicans in this election. But also she has to think about her relations with the United States of America, particularly over migration and the border fence in the north.
Those problems of security here in Mexico, the migrant issue on the border and relations with the United States as it focuses on its own presidential elections are huge issues the new administration will have to deal with. Right now, though, they're celebrating an historic day. Stuart Ramsey, Sky News, Northern Mexico.
Well, more from Stuart in a minute from Chihuahua, but let's just take a moment to take a look at exactly who Mexico's new president is. Claudia Sheinbaum is the former mayor of Mexico City and a climate scientist who was a part of a United Nations panel that received a Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. She promises to continue the work of predecessor and mentor President Obrador, who lifted millions of Mexicans out of poverty and doubled the minimum wage. But she faces very significant challenges. The election has been Mexico's bloodiest in modern history, with 37 candidates assassinated, and drug cartel violence is at a historic high, with many citizens fleeing the country for the US. Sheinbaum vows to improve security, but she's also up against extreme levels of femicide. Nearly 2,500 women were reported missing in 2022, though groups say the real number is probably even higher than that. Well, our chief correspondent Stuart Ramsey joins me now from the northern state of Chihuahua. Stuart, thank you for joining us. So you get the impression it's all changed because she's a female president for the first time, but she's also a protege of the outgoing president. So in a sense, sort of more of the same, a continuity candidate. What were the big issues that determined this election, do you think?
Well, you're right, she is continuity, but I think this is a massively historic day. I don't think many people in Mexico thought that they would have a female leader, and certainly not the first country in North America to have a female president. I think many people thought it would be the United States or Canada first, but obviously it's Mexico that has beaten them to it. Now, in this election, I think it's fair to say that personal security, the power of the cartels, corruption, which is absolutely endemic, were the really big one, really big issue that affected the election. Now, what's interesting is she didn't particularly campaign on that. They talked much more about the social policies that they've put in place, which are very popular. But this crime and the cartels is not something that's going to go away. She said she is going to deal with this in a big way, but she hasn't really identified exactly how she's going to do it. Now, I would actually say, look, the presidents in Mexico have been struggling with the cartels and crime for a very, very long time, and none of them have been successful at containing them. So she's got quite a lot ahead of her when it comes to that, to try to change things here. She said the bloodiest election that's ever been. Even on the day candidates were killed when they went to the polls. So it's a big problem, one that the country wants to see changes on. But I say it's a massive problem for her to deal with straight away.
And obviously one of the big issues that people are looking at from outside Mexico, particularly North America, of course, is that border and the huge numbers of migrants flowing across it. Not Mexicans so much anymore, but flowing through Mexico, of course. Is there any sign of Claudia Sheinbaum being able to deal with that? Or because her predecessor has clearly failed to do so, is she expected to do a better job at that?
Do you know what's really interesting? Migration itself is a political issue. Well, it isn't a political issue here because the migrants enter and by and large don't stay and leave. Then they don't vote either. So it's not something that the internal politics worry about. But the president does have a problem with it. Now, we've seen that the United States, and there's no doubt about it, been putting pressure on the past administration, and will continue with this one, to stop migrants getting to the northern border with the United States. But it isn't actually solving the issue in any way, shape or form. The people are just staying in the country, they get north and they're pushed back south again. So it's not being dealt with. For her now, with the presidential elections taking place in the United States, she's going to be looking closely at who wins. If it's Biden, they're much more likely to be able to come up with deals, some type of negotiated way forward to sort of see if they can find some sort of solution to this. If it's Donald Trump, well, then anything's possible. He could put the military on the border, he can close the borders, bring out the National Guard. So you don't know what will happen if he was to become the president again. I think when it comes to migration and that border, really it's one of those examples of something that the president of Mexico has to deal with. It's not necessarily migration itself, but it's an indicator of how what future relationship she will have with the United States. She's promising already that it's going to be a good one, but we'll have to see.
Stuart, you've done a huge amount of reporting from the cartel areas, those areas, I mean, owned completely by and operated by, or controlled at least by, cartels. They're sort of narco states within the state of Mexico. Do you think that that's a problem that a new president can deal with, or has Sheinbaum's party in the past sort of formed a kind of accommodation with those cartels? Is that something she's going to change, or do you think that's sort of going to continue? Is that corruption and that amount of cartel crime, is that just now sort of written into the way Mexico works indefinitely?
Right, there's quite a few there, but let me just go with this firstly. Cartel control of fundamental businesses, everything that happens across the whole of the country is simply staggering. And they are in governments, they're in local governments, they're in the police forces, they're even in the special forces. Their influence is really quite staggering. Lots of presidents have attempted to take them on. Some of them try to find an accommodation. Now, the past administration, what it was saying is, we're not just going to fight them. What we need to do is to change the social roots of people who join the cartels, which, as you can imagine, are young men who mainly come from poor backgrounds. They are easy meat to the cartels. There's not enough employment for them, so they're taken in by them. So what they're promising, or trying to promise to do, is to make life better for people in the poorer neighborhoods, bring jobs there, wean them off involvement with the cartels. That is a really long process that will take place. And the cartels, of course, do have an opinion on this. They've got huge amounts of wealth. I mean, really staggering amounts of wealth. And they have shown themselves capable of buying off all the way up to the top echelons of power in this country over decades now, and they've been getting more and more powerful. So she wants to take them on. Well, in the past, we've seen that, particularly with the Marines were deployed against them, and there's been some huge amounts of violence. It has failed. The cartels continue with their business, and it barely breaks. They didn't even stop business when COVID was happening, when nobody could move things around the world. The cartels were able to do it, if you need an example of just how well organized they are. It's part of society, and it goes all the way through it, through corruption. Virtually every element of life here, there's some type of corruption. Some of it's very small, and some of it's very, very big indeed. So I'll be honest with you, in the short term, I don't see how much difference she can make. But those policies about bringing about change at the grassroots will probably be effective in the long term. But we're talking a really long time, because cartel and crime here is absolutely ingrained in society.
Stuart, fascinating reporting from Mexico, as ever. Thank you very much for joining us from Chihuahua. And we're going to also talk to Juliana Fragoso now, who is in Mexico City, a different part of Mexico, in the capital there. Juliana's a journalist who's been working from Mexico, particularly on women's rights and investigative journalism there. Juliana, thanks for joining us. She is, let's talk about the fact that she is Mexico's first female president. As Stuart was saying, it's a historic moment, and the Mexicans will be very proud that they've got there before the Americans north of the border. And given Mexico's high levels of gender-based violence and gender disparities, it's a huge deal. Is that how it's being seen there? Are the Mexicans proud of the fact they've now got a female president?
I hope so, for the good of the women in this country. If things don't change, the issue of violence against women will continue to haunt Claudia Sheinbaum throughout her term. Legitimizing herself among women will be crucial for her government success. I think so. And we are not just talking about feminicide, which is a huge problem in the country. We are also addressing the needs of mothers of the missing persons, the salary inequality, spaces, and education that promotes respect for women. Yesterday, in her victory speech, one of her first sentences was, "It's not just we, it's all the women in the country." I hope the statement goes beyond words and becomes into actions in a short term.
Juliana, as Stuart was saying there, she is the first female president and therefore represents change, but also she is the protege, the continuation of former President Obrador. Is there concern about that in Mexico, that she doesn't represent enough change? And will there be pressure on her, do you think, to sort of be her own woman, to break from the past and show that she can rule the country in her own way, not just as a continuation of her predecessors' policies?
Certainly, it's definitely going to be an issue in her government because here the opposition played a decisive role in her victory because their candidates were not the best. I must say, sorry. And some even unpopular with their own politician parties. What's interesting is that Moreno is the President López Obrador. So when people realize that this time voting for Morena not necessarily means to vote for López Obrador, of course, this change will set an effect into the popularity of the next president. So it's going to be a real issue for Claudia Sheinbaum. She will need charisma. As you know, López Obrador has been the most popular president in the last 30 or 40 years in Mexico. And she also will need to take a very good decision of governance, and of course a very interesting public relations and image program to avoid disenchantment with the voters.
Juliana Fragoso, thank you very much, and apologies for the quality of the sound on that line. Difficult connection to Mexico City. And just some breaking news out of Washington, D.C. On that story. The White House saying that President Biden has spoken to Mexico's president-elect, Claudia Sheinbaum, and the two leaders have emphasised their commitment to continuing strong and collaborative partnership. So that's the latest on the Mexican election out of Washington. This is The World with me, Dominic Wagcorn. After the break, India's worst heatwave in decades. Millions in northern and central parts of the country swelter in record-breaking temperatures as poorer people struggle to find clean water.
We'd all fled to London because of the widespread homophobia that there was in our communities, and we didn't expect a Welsh mining community to be any different. All I wanted was to be accepted. That's all we ever wanted. In those few seconds in a miners' hall in Wales, I was just given that absolute acceptance.
Are you ready? Don't worry, you better get ready. Don't worry, you better get ready about the caravan.
It's an amazing story. So 40 years ago, during the miners' strike, one of the biggest industrial disputes this country ever saw, a group of gay people in London decided that they were going to support the miners. They went out and fundraised, raised money, and decided to twin with a Welsh mining community in South Wales, sent them the money at a time when the country was incredibly homophobic. But despite that, this community accepted them with open arms, and it was the beginning of an amazing friendship and bond that lasts to this day. And this film tells the story of that year and also shows the impact of that story and how it's changed the course of queer rights in this country and had a big impact on LGBT people today.
It's probably true, your observation, that it seemed there were two very different communities. But in fact, through the process of getting to know each other, we found we had an awful lot in common.
Like what?
Well, we were both struggling against a society that was, for our case, it was homophobic. For the miners' community, they were struggling to in an industrial dispute, they were had a lot of opposition to what they were trying to do, which was to save their jobs. So we were both communities of struggle, communities that were up against it. And coming together, we were able to support one another. Something about solidarity, old-fashioned word, but there was solidarity there.
Welcome back. We're going to cross to India now. The country is no stranger, of course, to hot weather, but this year millions are experiencing one of the worst heat waves in decades. In some places, temperatures have reached over 50 degrees Celsius. Dozens have died, and as our correspondent Neville Lazarus reports, the situation for many across the country is only getting worse.
They wait for hours in the scorching heat for water, and then a scramble to get their pipes in, a desperate effort to get every precious drop. This is all the families will get in a day for drinking, cooking and washing. There is no running water in scores of homes nestled around the affluent diplomatic enclave of the national capital. And at this cluster, it has been going on for years.
We've been standing in line since the early morning, hungry and thirsty for water. There are a lot of problems. Those with babies have to wait here with them too.
We have to go to work too, so we choose between water and work. There has to be one member of the family around to fill, otherwise we won't get any.
There are some days this lifeline does not show up, and buying water is not an option for many. Families complain of the quality of the water.
We once found a rat and a slipper inside the tanker. This water is unfit to drink.
Sometimes the water is dirty and smells, but we're helpless as there's no other source.
India is reeling under a severe heat wave, and there are still many weeks to go. Schools have been closed early in anticipation. Water is scarce and the electricity grid is overwhelmed, with power shortages making life even more difficult in the searing heat. Temperatures are reaching record levels, above 47 degrees here in Delhi. That's more than 116 degrees Fahrenheit. Earlier, there were short spells of the heat wave, but now we are witnessing prolonged periods of intense heat. As a result, reservoirs and water channels are drying up, having a devastating effect on farming, with production of food and cash crops falling drastically. For many, working under this blistering sun is the only option to livelihood. For a day's work at this site, Anil gets £5. It's extremely hot, but for us labourers, there's no option. We have to earn a living for our children and families. India is in the midst of a general election, and the government is yet to come up with a heat action plan to bring any relief for its citizens. Neville Lazarus, Sky News, Delhi.
So is enough being done by the government to India to counter the extreme heat? I'm joined now by the climate activist Disha Ravi, whose campaigns on the issue of climate change have gained global attention, and her a spell in Indian detention. Disha, thank you so much for joining us tonight on The World. First of all, 50 degrees Celsius, what is that like? People, I think, will have trouble imagining what it's like, but what is it like living when the temperatures are that hot?
It's incredibly hard to explain because half the time it feels like your face is melting off and there's like a constant headache, because more than 75%, more than 80% of India doesn't have access to air conditioning. And as the people who do have access to air conditioning are people who are already working indoors and who are not subject to work outdoors, people who are not daily wage workers. Imagine working every single day under these temperatures in the scorching hot sun. These are things that cannot be explained. We are pushing the limits of human survivability, and it is the worst impact is being experienced by people who've least contributed to the climate crisis.
So we've got two big stories going on in India at the moment. Of course, the heat wave and then the election as well. Is the heat wave and the climate change issue that surrounds it, of course, is that having much of an impact during the election, or are they kind of being considered rather separately? Are the Indians increasingly worried about climate change given what is happening to their weather?
So what's interesting is recently a few people who were working on the elections, the electoral poll members itself were collapse and they had to be rushed to the hospital during election duty. But unfortunately, the heat wave and the heat as a subject hasn't been a part of any of the manifestos of any of the parties. It hasn't been climate change, although mentioned in the manifestos, every single manifestos of every single party for the first time ever, hasn't been a rallying cry for any of the parties. They haven't mentioned concrete steps of action to address the heat or even address the promises they were making in the manifestos about different aspects of climate change.
So you were arrested, I mean, I think involved in campaigning against environmentally damaging buildings, but after farmers' protests, you were arrested using, I think, colonial-era laws, which caused a lot of concern, consternation, not just in the environmental movement in India, but around the world. Are things shifting now? Is there more sympathy for campaigners like you now that the sort of effects of climate change are becoming painfully clear for Indians?
Yes, I think people are able to see firsthand the impacts of the climate crisis. The issue is that in media, it's often framed as a one-off event or a natural disaster, and the ties to the climate crisis aren't emphasized enough, even when they are emphasized. So the general population's access to climate education is very limited, and that limits our demand of accountability on action for the climate crisis from our authorities.
But I get the impression you're not sort of leading people out on the streets in great numbers. They're not making that connection still between what's happening to them in their daily lives this summer and what they could be doing politically about it.
There have been a lot of actions and rallies around the climate crisis on the street, but the issue is that protests in itself have been limited in the country, especially around the elections. So people, the information people are getting are from different campaigns that not just Fridays for Future India, but other climate groups are doing, and other civil society groups are doing. And while the knowledge and awareness about the climate crisis and its connection with the heat has drastically improved over the years, it's still not the same, and it's still not a voting issue for citizens.
What is the concern at the moment? This is going to go on indefinitely, I think, this 50°C temperature. Is there any end in sight at all? What's it like looking at that future, immediate future at least, in India, with this weather just continuing, it seems, indefinitely?
So in my city of Bangalore, we've had some relief because we've suddenly had rain, and that's because of different changing temperatures in the oceans nearby. So up north, they're also hoping for the same sort of relief from rain and the monsoon season coming through. But we are not fully hopeful of when that'll happen for northern and central India. In terms of what's a concern for the election itself, I think it's the fact that employment has been at an all-time low, and also poverty has been at an all-time increase. It's really hard to worry about the fact that you don't have water to drink, or you can't survive the heat when you don't even have the money to buy water required, or the fact that you can't buy say fans, or like the video you showed, you'll have to choose between employment and having water to drink. It's really hard to be focused on one thing when you're trying to just survive and get by from one day to another.
Disha, thank you very much. Glad to hear there's some relief, at least in terms of rain, even if the weather looks like it's going to continue indefinitely at that kind of temperature. Thank you for joining us. You are watching The World with me, Dominic Wagcorn. After the break, is NATO on the brink of war? Moscow warns of all-out conflict with the West after Ukraine was given the green light to strike Russian territory with American weapons. But does Putin really want things to escalate? Welcome back. Now, it's safe to say that when the green light was given by the US for Ukraine to strike Russian territory with American weapons, it was never going to go down well. Moscow insists there will be fatal consequences, with one Kremlin chief warning it could end up in all-out war between Russia and the West. But does Vladimir Putin really want a war with NATO? Britain's chief of the defence staff, Admiral Sir Tony Radakin, doesn't think so. He's been speaking to our security and defence editor, Deborah Haynes, ahead of this year's D-Day anniversary.
150,000 soldiers in one day, 7,000 ships, over 1,000 warships, 2,000 aircraft.
Britain's defence chief recalls the heroics of D-Day on the 6th of June 1944. Frozen in time on a giant map at Southwark House in Hampshire, where a lot of the planning was done.
If called upon today, would the nation respond in the same way as they did back in, 80 years ago?
Absolutely. I think our nation has got that pride, that commitment.
He drew similarities between Allied action against the Nazis in World War II and how nations today are rallying together to help Ukraine counter Russia's invasion.
It's a war of economies, it's a war of logistics, it's a war of industrial production, it's a war of political will, it's all of those things for the simplicity of bringing peace back to the people of Ukraine.
How confident are you that Ukraine will endure and will succeed?
I'm hugely confident. By the end of June, Russia will have lost 500,000 people killed and wounded. We are already past 800 days for a war that Putin anticipated to be 3 days long. And this is tough for Ukraine, but we have to maintain our support.
With an election underway, the military chief wouldn't be drawn on UK defence matters. But he did talk about the significance of this moment, when Iran launched hundreds of missiles and drones at Israel that were intercepted with help from the US, the UK and others.
I don't think our potential adversaries would have been able to respond in the way that you saw on the evening of April the 13th.
So you don't think Beijing or Moscow could have done that?
I think the US leadership and the proficiency that we have with our allies is at a level above our potential foes.
As Britain and its allies prepare to remember D-Day, the Admiral says he doesn't think another world war is imminent, despite hostility, in particular from Vladimir Putin's Russia.
Putin does not want a war with NATO. Putin does not want a nuclear war. And we have enormous overmatch because of the strength of NATO.
Yet, with Ukraine still a war zone, the risk of wider conflict returning to Europe surely remains. Deborah Haynes, Sky News.
Well, earlier I spoke to NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg, who told me Ukraine has every right to strike across its borders.
Different allies have imposed different types of restrictions, and some allies have imposed no restrictions at all on the use of weapons they have donated to Ukraine. Ukraine has already been able to strike deep into Russia. They have their own weapons they have produced, and as I said, some allies have not imposed any restrictions on the use of the weapons they have.
But the Americans, we'd like to see them allowed
between allies. But the point is that some of those allies that had restrictions have now reduced the magnitude of those restrictions, enabling the Ukrainians to do what is most urgent, and that is to protect themselves against the attacks which are now launched from Russian territory.
Just to push you on that before we move forward, though, would you like to see the Americans relaxing the rules further, particularly, specifically, on their weapons, so the Ukrainians could strike deeper with those weapons beyond the Kharkiv region?
So we had good discussions on this at the NATO Foreign Ministerial meeting last week in Prague. I welcome the decisions that have been made by some allies over the last days. I will not go into specific or give recommendations to specific allies on TV. We have good internal considerations, deliberations on these issues in NATO.
Just talking about what's happening in the Kharkiv region now, how worried are you by these advances the Russians have made in the last few weeks?
There is a difficult situation on the battlefield, and we have seen the Russians making some marginal gains, but we don't expect any major breakthrough. Wars are, of course, always difficult to predict, but so far we haven't seen any concentration of forces on the Russian side that will enable them to have a major breakthrough. But it demonstrates that the need for us to step up our support. Over the last months, there have been some serious delays in support from NATO allies. The US spent 6 months agreeing a new package for Ukraine, and some European allies have not been able to deliver what they have promised. So that's one of the reasons why we now are addressing in NATO how we can give NATO a bigger role in coordinating support for Ukraine, and also agree a multi-year financial pledge, so we have more predictability, more sustainability and more accountability when it comes to supporting Ukraine to ensure that we don't have the same delays and gaps in supply for Ukraine as we have seen over the last months.
Yeah, can you explain further about that? Because the latest research from Bain and company and other consultancies seems to show that the Ukrainians or the West are getting and refurbishing shells about the third of the speed of the Russians. The Russians are developing, making and refurbishing artillery shells at 3 times the speed that the West can supply them to the Ukrainians. Why is NATO, with all its military and economic might, so slow?
It's correct that Russia has been able to build up their defense industry faster than we expected, and it's correct that NATO allies have spent more time than they should in ramping up our production. And that reflects that after the end of the Cold War, we actually built down our defense industry. Now this is changing. The United Kingdom, all the NATO allies are increasing the capacity to produce ammunition, weapons. We have the United States, which have over the last months doubled its capacity to produce 155 standard ammunition, and within not so long time will produce roughly 100,000 per month. So this is really changing, and therefore also the flow of ammunition into Ukraine has increased over the last weeks.
You've always talked very diplomatically about this, but behind that diplomatic demeanour, one suspects there's a kind of frustration about how behind the curve the West is over this and how much ahead of the game the Russians seem to be. How frustrating has that been for you in your time in office?
I think we need to remind ourselves of how this war started. Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February, and most experts and President Putin himself, he thought that he was going to take control over Kiev within days and the rest of Ukraine within weeks. That didn't happen. The Ukrainians have actually been able to liberate 50% of the territory that Russia occupied at the beginning of the war. They have been able to sink a significant number of Russian naval ships in the Black Sea, opening up a corridor in the Black Sea, and they've been able to conduct deep strikes against Russian military capabilities, inflicting heavy losses on the Russian armed forces. So Russia and President Putin made a big mistake by underestimating the Ukrainians, but also underestimating the willingness, the commitment of NATO allies to support Ukraine. And therefore, the main issue in this war is about whether Ukraine will prevail as a sovereign independent nation that can be member of NATO, member of the European Union. And the reality is that Ukraine will prevail because NATO allies are now stepping up our support, and we are committing to a more long-term predictable support. And therefore, this is a big strategic mistake for Putin. He has not achieved his main goal to control Ukraine.
A lot of concern about Donald Trump winning the upcoming American election. If he does so and he pulls America out of NATO, can the European end of NATO continue to support Ukraine, or will Russia win this conflict?
I'm absolutely confident that both European allies and the United States will continue to support Ukraine because it is in our security interest to support Ukraine, and therefore I expect also the US to do so, regardless of the outcome of the elections. Because we have to understand that if President Putin wins in Ukraine, it's not only a tragedy for the Ukrainians, but it will send a message to President Putin that when he uses military force, when he violates international law, he gets what he wants. That will make the world more dangerous and us more vulnerable. So therefore, it is in our security interest to support Ukraine, and therefore we should do that also in the future.
NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg there. This is The World with me, Dominic Wackon. After the break, the next court case to distract American politics. President Biden publicly shows love and support for his son as a dad on the first day of Hunter Biden's federal gun trial.
Mandatory evacuation, you must leave!
For many people, Harvey is far from over. Christchurch has been changed forever by what happened here.
There was a river of blood coming out of the mosque. That's a scene that you don't forget.
Ida has certainly left its mark on New Orleans.
It just feels heartbreaking.
We help you understand the world with us. We are standing on the supply line right into the heart of America's opioid crisis. I've reported from around the world and around the UK. Are you trying to run me over, Sir Philip? No, go away. Look like it, sir. Will you respond to those who've made accusations, Sir Philip? Can you go away? Joe Biden knows the celebrations are over, and this is a country in crisis.
You don't want to be remembered this way. You always want to be remembered in something positive.
It is almost impossible to predict where these fires will go next. This gives you an idea of the strength of those winds, strong enough to bend and twist metal.
Do you regret the tweet, Gary?
There's no sign, publicly at least, of either side being willing to give ground. How do you reassure the public that all of these mistakes wouldn't be made again? I'm Greg Milam, and I'm Sky's Chief North of England correspondent.
Welcome back. Israel today confirmed the deaths of 4 hostages being held by Hamas in Gaza. Among them was 51-year-old British-Israeli Nadav Popplewell. The Israeli army says their deaths have been confirmed after assessing new intelligence. Around 80 hostages who were taken during Hamas's attack on October the 7th are still believed to be held alive inside the Gaza Strip.
Hamas is holding women, children, the sick and the elderly hostage in Gaza. We will keep on doing everything we need for their freedom, to bring them home. This is what any other decent country in the world will do.
And in the last hour, Foreign Secretary David Cameron posted on social media saying he's greatly saddened to hear about the death of Nadav Popplewell, who had been held in captivity by Hamas since October the 7th. My thoughts, he said, are with his loved ones at this terrible time for them. With a new deal on the table, we reiterate our demand for Hamas to send all hostages home. Well, over to America now, and it seems that court cases are dominating American politics in recent months. Of course, we had former President Trump being convicted last week, and today another trial, this time the current president's son. Hunter Biden is facing 3 firearm-related charges. Today his father, Joe Biden, made a point of displaying his love and support, not as president, but as a dad. Our US correspondent Mark Stone joins me now from Washington. Mark, thanks for joining us. First of all, what is this case all about?
Well, I should say, first of all, you say that President Biden has made comments about it, not as president, but as a dad. But he did it on official White House-headed notepaper. And I think that will raise a few eyebrows that he is getting involved politically when maybe he ought not to. But you're right, another week, another court case involving the presidency in one way or another. This is historic in that it's the first time that a sitting president's son or child has been in court on what are serious charges. 3 charges against him. 2 are for filling in a form in order to obtain a gun and lying on that form and saying he was not using illegal drugs. Hunter Biden, of course, has had some considerable difficulty with addiction over the course of his life. The 3rd charge relates to owning a weapon while using narcotics. Very serious charges, and if convicted, he faces potentially up to 25 years in prison. The reality is, I don't think that would happen, but nevertheless, this is serious indeed. Now, he was in court today. Obviously, this was the first day where they were selecting a jury. That jury has now been selected as of about half an hour ago, and so the trial proper can get underway. President Biden was not there in court to support him, but many other members of the Biden family were, including his stepmother, Jill Biden, the First Lady. Her birthday today, there was a joke in court where Hunter Biden said to his stepmother, I've put on a show for you for your birthday, a reference there to the court, and there was some laughter there. In terms of that statement, I'll read it to you. The president says, I am the president, but I'm also a dad. Jill and I love our son, and we're so proud of the man he is today. It goes on to say, Hunter's resilience in the face of adversity and strength he has brought to his recovery are inspiring to us. A lot of families have loved ones who have overcome addiction and know what we mean. And he goes on to say, as president, I don't and won't comment on pending federal cases, but as a dad, I have boundless love for my son, confidence in him and respect for his strength. Our family has been through a lot together, and Jill and I are going to continue to be there for Hunter and our family with our love and support. The trial, Dom, is due to last a few weeks, and I think that just as with the Trump trial last week, obviously entirely different in nature, but during the course of that trial, many interesting details came out that we were not previously aware of. I'm sure, just as with all court cases, this will be intriguing.
Well, there's a lot of intriguing details, aren't there, of course, reportedly from Hunter Biden's laptop that he put in for repair, and all kinds of material was found on that. And he's become this kind of very controversial figure, a real bête noire for the right of American politics. How serious a threat do you think this case is to President Biden, or is it just sort of fodder for the right wing of American talk radio and rolling news television that they'll just feed on? Is there a genuine threat, do you think, electorally from this case that the president, Hunter's dad, needs to worry about?
Well, I think he does worry about it. I think it doesn't look good at all that his son is in court on these serious charges. You're right, Hunter Biden has been the sort of bogeyman of the right of politics here. They are always trying to cast the Biden family as being corrupt, and whether it's conspiracy or not, Hunter is always at the centre of that. He has led, as his father alluded to in that statement, a difficult life, a colourful life, some might say. And so he is kind of easy fodder in that sense. And just the fact that the perception of the justice system being politicised, whether it be on the right with the Trump trial, whether it be on the left with this, the perception that the justice system is politicised is damaging. It damages a key pillar of the democratic structures of this country, and at a time when the country is so bitterly divided. So it's not a good position for the country to be in, and you can imagine that as this court case goes on, as I say, it will only last a couple of weeks probably, but there will be details that come out, and I think for Joe Biden they'll be difficult for sure.
And is there a sense, do you think, that there could be more of this to come, and that the Trump trial has sort of set a precedent that the president's rivals might make use of if they get back in the White House?
Yeah, I mean, certainly they have. Former President Trump has talked about retribution, so potentially there could be a lot of problems there. The other point to make, though, is that the other 3 Trump trials that are due to get underway, one of them in Florida has now been, in Atlanta has now been delayed again. So even more certainty now that one, and maybe the other 2 as well, won't happen before the election.
Mark Stone in Washington, thank you very much for that. The latest on the Hunter Biden trial, the latest episode of lawfare, as they call it in America. That's all for tonight's programme. Thank you for watching, and a reminder of our top story: Mexico electing its first ever woman president, Claudia Sheinbaum, and the election theme is sure to feature again tomorrow, with results in India expected. Prime Minister Narendra Modi is aiming for a 3rd term in office. We'll bring you coverage and reaction of that tomorrow. Be sure to join us at 9 o'clock here on The World. The news at 10 is up next.